And I'd like to thank you for the coming to the joint informational hearing of the Senate Transportation Housing Committee and Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Subcommittee number 2 on Resources, Environmental Protection, Energy, and Transportation, chaired by my colleague Lois Wolk. And my name is Jim Bell. I am the chairman of the Transportation and Housing Committee. We're having a hearing today to discuss finance issues regarding the transportation maintenance backlog and having a joint hearing on that subject. California's infrastructure system is the largest and most complex in the nation. Historical investments in freeways, roads, bridges, and other transportation infrastructure have fueled the state's phenomenal economic growth. However, today, California's transportation system is in jeopardy. The state of California has underfunded the maintenance and rehabilitation of its road system for decades. Our system is aging rapidly, and with much of our road and bridge infrastructure past its expected lifespan, rehabilitation and maintenance costs for both the state system and local streets and roads are skyrocketing. Confounding this problem is the fact that we have not increased the base revenues for transportation funds since the early 1990s. The stagnant revenue stream has combined with the rising costs of maintaining the aging system leads us to our current situation in which we have a $59 billion backlog in maintenance of the state system and an equally staggering backlog in the local system. It is important that we act now to alleviate these funding shortfalls. The true cost of deferred maintenance is compounded over time. Roads that are not properly maintained require more costly rehabilitation and reconstruction long before the projected end of their useful lives. Pavement rehabilitation and reconstruction projects are by far the most expensive type of maintenance projects. Therefore, it's an imperative to resolve this funding backlog soon. Acting now before it's too late can save us billions of dollars. And today we're going to hear testimony identifying the needs of both the state and local road systems, and we will also be presented with options to address the transportation maintenance backlog. I'd like to also point out that we had a field hearing on the subject in December of this committee in San Jose, and we're going to continue having a field hearing in Los Angeles on March 13th in Los Angeles. So I welcome the public and invite my comments from my colleague, Lois Wolk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here today, although much of the news that we're going to hear is probably not very positive. We have an extraordinary amount of need for transportation projects and for operations and maintenance in our communities, both state and local. Coming from local government, as most of us do, we know that over the last decade, there has been a serious problem in financing just the most basics of our communities. The one positive thing, I think, is compared to water issues, which you know that I spend a great deal of time on, in transportation, we really do know and have a great deal of consensus about what the needs are. And we have a transportation funding system that is quite rational. Unfortunately, we don't have funding, and we are struggling with what is the best mechanism to improve that, to improve our source of funding necessary infrastructure. Over the last decade or two, we've seen what has been traditionally the regular and expected stable sources of revenue which came from the feds every so many years is not there any longer. That's placed incredible pressure now on states and the local communities. So I'm looking forward to today's hearing and for whatever wisdom and magic bullets we can come up with in the next hour and a half. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair Wolk. And I'll invite other senators to make opening remarks. Senator Cannella, my vice chair.
All right, thank you, sir. I'm interested. This is obviously a big priority for the state of California, and it's very clear that we have more needs than we have money. And if you look at kind of the history of spending in California, I have a little chart here from, this is expenditures in the mid-1960s. At that time, we spent 15% of our general fund on transportation, and this year it's proposed to spend 7%. And if you remove the funding for high-speed rail, it's really less than 4% that we're spending on our roads. So I think, last 4 years we were able to deal with water. I think that we achieved something that most people didn't think we could do. And it's my hope in the next couple of years that we can do the same level of focus and hopefully deliverables when it comes to transportation as well. So I'm excited to get into this.
Thank you, Senator. Others? Okay. We'll begin with our panel. So the first panel, I'd like to invite Brian Kelly, Secretary of the State Transportation Agency, Stephen Keck from Budget Director of Caltrans, and Jennifer Whiting, Assistant Legislative Director from the League of Cities. So the three of you, welcome, and they're going to address the needs, identifying the needs of both the state and local systems. So I'll start off with Brian, and welcome.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chair, pleased to be here today, and I appreciate very much, thank you for the opportunity to testify before your committee on this important issue. For the record, I am Brian Kelly with the California State Transportation Agency, and as I reminded Randy Chin, a former Senate staffer. The issue you are highlighting today at this hearing, transportation funding in California, is both a timely an important issue for the state's economic future and our collective quality of life. You will hear presentations today from the Department of Transportation, the gentleman to my right, and from the California Transportation Commission, as well as others that will highlight a staggering mismatch between the state's available transportation funding and our collective needs. And by collective needs, that includes state and local those of the state, local agencies, and transit providers. The mismatch between available funding and needs has been a constant feature in the state's transportation sector for the last 3 decades. In 1999, the legislature called on the CTC to conduct a needs assessment that revealed a 10-year, $108 billion unfunded need. In 2006, the legislature approved and the voters passed an historic bond dedicating $19.9 billion for transportation improvements. While Proposition 1B delivered many valued projects that will serve Californians for decades to come, a 2011 updated needs assessment from the CCC estimated a 10-year unfunded need of some $296 billion. The short story is this: needs in California's large and complex transportation system will always outpace available funding. Funding solutions over the past decade and a half have too often been one-time in nature to address immediate needs, rather than efforts to stabilize the state's transportation funding picture with a reliable user-based source of revenue. A couple of examples of the lack of attention to long-term revenue for transportation. The state gas tax has not been raised or affected in any way in 21 years. The federal gas tax has not been raised in 22 years. Weight fees have not been meaningfully adjusted since 1990, and the gas excise tax does not rise with inflation, which erodes the value of the tax over time. So while needs continue to grow, commensurate revenue does not grow with those needs. As noted too often over the last several years, transportation funding solutions have gotten away from the historic user-based long-term solution, relying more on one-time solutions or solutions that have transportation compete for funding from the general fund, which historically has exacerbated the system's funding instability. As you'll hear from Mr. Keck shortly, that funding instability will be made worse with the emergence of more efficient vehicles in California. While this is a positive development from an emissions and public health perspective, it does portend a decrease in gasoline consumption and some loss in revenues for infrastructure investments. What is needed most to stabilize our critical condition is long-term sources of user-based transportation funding focused on the state's most pressing needs. Again, as you hear Mr. Keck's presentation, you will see that that is in line with the long history of funding transportation in California. The good news is that if we deliver on stable, ongoing funding solutions and focus on the highest tier of transportation needs, we can deliver significant improvements to our transportation system to improve our economy and the livability of our communities. The Brown administration is taking steps to prioritize our needs, invest emerging sources of funds in transportation, and explore stable funding solutions in both the midterm and the long term. On the priority side, we're adopting and have adopted a fix-it-first philosophy for transportation. Focus on maintaining our existing roads, highways, and bridges before we build new ones, invest in low-cost technology that makes our state highway system run more efficiently. We believe such technology is helpful in managing congestion and improving the operations and getting greater capacity out of the existing system. That includes things like cameras, traffic sensors, changeable message signs, ramp metering lights, et cetera. In fiscal year 2014-15, we repaid early a $351 million loan from the state highway account to the general fund, and we dedicated that loan repayment to fix-it-first investments, including preservation and operational improvements on both the state highway system and local streets and roads. While the legislature passed and the voters, legislature enacted and the voters passed an historic Proposition 1B in 2006, it's worth reminding everybody that just $500 million out of that $20 billion bond measure was dedicated to the preservation and maintenance of the state highway system. We would propose heightened attention to this area with any new funding plan, with specific objectives to be achieved over the next decade, such as making sure that 90% of our state highway lanes are in good condition. Some 1,000 bridges are repaired, replaced, or brought up to today's design standards. 90% of designated culverts are in good health. 90% of our ITS equipment in good operating condition to improve highway operations. We also would encourage investment in the state's trade corridors. California has a large, complex, and robust trade industry. It is home to 3 of the 5 largest seaports in the country. It is the entry point for 40% of the nation's containerized imports. It includes thousands of miles of freight railroad tracks, and it shares 6 land port of entries with the country of Mexico. The state invested specifically in its trade corridors for the first time with the passage of 1B in 2006. A robust goods movement system contributes to the economic development and commerce of the state and also to our quality of life. Actions we're taking to invest emerging funds in transportation include the investment plan that came out of the SB 862, the trailer bill from last year. The administration is moving aggressively to get cap-and-trade funds to the streets. SB 862 provided that 60% of cap-and-trade funds be available for clean transportation projects. By law, projects funded with cap-and-trade revenues must result in quantifiable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The State Transportation Agency, Caltrans, and the Strategic Growth Council have adopted program guidelines that will make hundreds of millions of dollars available this June for public transit projects and active transportation, sustainable transportation investments related to sustainable community development. We are also in the process, working with all of you in this budget context, to implement some recommendations that came out of a stakeholder group we worked with last year to stabilize funding over the midterm and long term. The Transportation Agency is sponsoring and working with the Department of Finance on legislation to implement recommendations by this coalition of stakeholders, known as the CTIP Working Group. One is a trailer bill on tolling. The administration has proposed trailer bill language to streamline the process for approving toll lanes, which would both provide new funding and better traffic management. In many congested urban corridors, delay could be mitigated, maintenance more adequately funded with the addition of high occupancy toll lanes. High occupancy toll lanes generally allow use by high occupancy vehicles, transit vehicles, and also single occupant drivers who are willing to pay congestion-based tolls. We also are implementing legislation you all passed last year to implement SB 1077. We worked with stakeholders to pursue the exploration of new funding strategies to provide ongoing funding for transportation infrastructure over the long term. You will see in Mr. Keck's presentation that for the first time in decades, The projections of gas tax consumption is quite stabilizing, if not decreasing, as we go forward. That has a real economic impact to the money that we bring in for transportation investments. You all passed legislation carried by Senator DeSaulnay to have us explore the emergence or the viability of a road user charge that would have drivers pay a charge based on miles driven instead of how much gasoline they purchase. The bill requires the California Transportation Commission and the agency to work with an advisory committee to establish a pilot program to assess the viability of such a fee. Will Kempton, who will testify later today on behalf of the California Transportation Commission, will provide the committee with an update on the status of this program. Over the last couple of years, the administration's focus has been on providing stable funding for fix-it-first strategies and sustainable transportation programs that help the state meet its safety, mobility, and sustainability objectives. This year, the governor has asked that we work with the legislature and stakeholders to develop a coalition in support of developing a transportation funding package to reduce the deferred maintenance backlog on the state highway system. We have again engaged with our CTIP stakeholder group, and we look forward to working with all of you on a comprehensive package to achieve this objective. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chair, for the opportunity to testify here today. I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you very much.